It all began with an idea so powerful that it changed the course of the world. A land across the ocean where ordinary people dreamed of freedom, not as a privilege, but as a right. In the mid-18th century, 13 small colonies along the Atlantic coast were home to farmers, merchants, and thinkers who dared to imagine life without a king. They weren't united by wealth or armies, but by one burning belief that all men are created equal and that liberty is worth fighting for. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, those farmers and blacksmiths faced the greatest empire on earth. Yet they stood their ground. Their courage wasn't born from power, but from purpose. They fought not only for independence, but for a future they had never seen, a future where freedom could light the world. George Washington led them through brutal winters and impossible odds. He wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting for an ideal. Around him were men and women history almost forgot: spies, messengers, nurses, and thinkers who carried the revolution on their shoulders. While Washington led on the battlefield, men like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson crafted words sharper than any sword. Their declaration wasn't just a rebellion, it was a promise to humanity. But every revolution hides stories the world rarely tells. There was a man named Crispus Attucks, the first to fall in the Boston Massacre, a black man whose blood marked the beginning of America's fight for liberty. There was Sybil Ludington, just 16 years old, who rode through the night to warn militia troops of an impending British attack, a courage equal to Paul Revere's, though her name never echoed through history books. When independence was finally won, the dreamers became architects. They built a nation on words, not empires. The Constitution they wrote wasn't perfect, but it was alive, designed to evolve with each generation. It laid the foundation for something the world had never seen, a democracy by the people, for the people. Yet freedom, as America would learn, is never free. The early years tested the new republic. There were debates about power, equality, and the meaning of liberty. There were contradictions to a nation born from freedom that still held people in chains. But amid the struggle, voices rose. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, "Remember the ladies," planting early seeds of women's equality. Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved poet, captured the spirit of revolution in verse, proving that brilliance knows no color, no status, only courage. As the young nation expanded westward, dreams grew, and so did its conflicts. Every mile of progress carried stories of ambition and pain. Native tribes were pushed aside, their lands taken. Immigrants arrived, chasing the American dream, and through it all, the question echoed: what does it truly mean to be free? America's greatness wasn't born overnight. It was forged in the tension between its ideals and its flaws, between what it was and what it aspired to be. Each generation would redefine it, challenge it, and shape it anew. From the dusty roads of Virginia to the halls of Philadelphia, from the silent riders in the dark to the fiery words written by candlelight, a nation was being born not just on paper, but in the hearts of millions. The story of the United States is not the story of perfection. It is the story of persistence, of men and women who saw something greater than themselves and dared to reach for it. They laid down the first stones of a foundation that would carry future heroes, known and unknown, who would push that dream further than they could ever imagine. As the 19th century dawned, America was growing fast in size, in ambition, and in contradiction. The dream of freedom was spreading, yet millions remained enslaved. The founders had built the frame, but the soul of the nation was still unfinished. Across fields and factories, whispers of justice began to rise. Some believed America's promise could never be real until every human being shared in its light. In secret homes and quiet churches, a movement was born. They called it abolition, the fight to end slavery. It was dangerous, illegal, and often deadly, but ordinary people became extraordinary in their courage. Harriet Tubman, a woman born into slavery, escaped and returned again and again to guide others to freedom. She carried no weapon but faith and determination. She became known as Moses, leading her people through darkness toward the light. Frederick Douglass, once enslaved, taught himself to read and write. His words shattered chains more powerfully than iron ever could. He spoke of a nation that preached liberty yet practiced oppression. His voice forced America to look into a mirror it had long avoided. And when the country finally tore itself apart in civil war, Douglass and countless others stood not just for victory, but for the very meaning of freedom. The Civil War was more than a battle between North and South. It was a reckoning, a test of the American promise. Brother fought brother, state fought state, and at the heart of it all was one question. Could a nation built on liberty survive half free and half enslaved? Abraham Lincoln, a man of humble beginnings, rose to answer that question. His words at Gettysburg still echo that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. But even Lincoln's greatness was shared by many whose names faded into time. Robert Smalls, an enslaved man, stole a Confederate ship under the cover of night and delivered it to Union forces, later becoming one of America's first black congressmen. Clara Barton risked her life on battlefields, tending to the wounded and forgotten. She later founded the American Red Cross, a symbol of compassion born from the ashes of war. When the guns finally fell silent, freedom had been written into law, but not yet into life. The years that followed Reconstruction were filled with hope and heartbreak. Schools were built, black Americans voted, and for a moment equality seemed within reach. But progress came at a price. The old powers resisted, and the struggle for true justice began again, this time not on battlefields, but in hearts and minds. Yet America moved forward. Immigrants arrived by the millions, Irish, Italian, Chinese, German, each chasing a dream whispered across oceans. They built railroads, factories, and cities, transforming the country into a new kind of empire, one powered by people. They faced prejudice and poverty, yet their sweat and sacrifice became the engine of progress. The 19th century also brought innovation that would reshape the world. Inventors like Thomas Edison turned darkness into light. Alexander Graham Bell made distance disappear with a voice over wire. And in dusty workshops and quiet barns, unknown tinkerers created machines that would define the modern age. But behind every famous name were countless invisible hands. Women working long hours in textile mills, miners digging through rock and danger, builders raising skylines from nothing but steel and grit. These were the unsung heroes of a nation in motion, not the ones who wrote laws or signed declarations, but the ones who made those dreams real with their hands. Through triumph and tragedy, America's greatest strength was not in its wealth or its weapons, but in its people, ordinary men and women who believed that tomorrow could be better, and though they didn't always agree on what better meant, they never stopped striving toward it. The dream survived every storm because someone, somewhere, refused to let it die. The war was over, but the work was just beginning. Out of the smoke and sorrow, a new America was taking shape, one of factories, railroads, and restless ambition. Cities rose where fields once stood. The sound of hammers and engines replaced the silence of the countryside. It was the dawn of the industrial age, and with it came both opportunity and challenge. In crowded tenements, immigrant families dreamed of a better life. They worked in steel mills, on railroads, and in the blazing heat of foundries, nameless workers whose sweat built the foundations of modern America. They came from Italy, Ireland, China, Poland, and countless other nations, bringing with them languages, traditions, and hope. They were not born in the United States, but they became the hands that built it. Amid the smoke of industry, a new kind of hero emerged, not a soldier or a politician, but an inventor. Thomas Edison filled the world with light. Nikola Tesla harnessed energy that seemed like magic. Henry Ford gave the working class the power of mobility. Yet for every famous innovator, there were hundreds whose brilliance never made headlines: women typing in patent offices, mechanics testing dangerous machines, immigrants designing ideas that others would claim. The American dream wasn't only about success, it was about creation. As technology raced ahead, the nation's conscience struggled to keep up. Factories grew rich, but children worked long hours in them. Cities sparkled, but poverty spread in their shadows. Out of this tension rose reformers who believed progress meant more than profit. Jane Addams opened settlement houses to help the poor. Ida B. Wells risked her life exposing injustice and racial violence. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton demanded the right to vote, their voices defying centuries of silence. Change was slow but unstoppable. The 20th century opened with America no longer a fragile experiment, it had become a powerhouse. Its influence stretched across oceans, and its ideals were watched by the world. When war erupted in Europe, America found itself torn between isolation and responsibility. But when it entered the First World War, it wasn't just to fight an enemy, it was to defend a belief that democracy must not die. The war brought sacrifice and innovation. Nurses like Helen Fairchild served on the front lines, saving lives under fire. African American soldiers fought bravely in segregated units, returning home to a country that still refused to see them as equals. Yet they carried pride, not bitterness, knowing they had earned their place in the story of freedom. The 1920s arrived with jazz and optimism. America was dancing into modernity, cars on every street, radios in every home, cities glowing with electric light. But beneath the rhythm and glamour, cracks were forming. The Great Depression struck like a storm no one saw coming. Millions lost jobs, homes, and hope. The dream of prosperity turned into a struggle for survival. Still, even in the darkest times, heroes rose. Farmers stood together to keep each other fed. Artists and writers turned pain into expression. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice over the radio gave courage to the broken. His New Deal didn't just rebuild the economy, it rebuilt faith in the promise that no American should stand alone in despair. By the 1930s, America was a nation of contradictions, scarred yet strong, divided yet determined. It had faced wars, depressions, and inequality, but every crisis had revealed something deeper: the resilience of its people, the idea that no matter how hard the fall, the country could rise again. And soon, that belief would be tested more than ever before. Across the oceans, a new darkness was spreading: tyranny, hatred, and global war. Once again, the United States would be called not only to defend itself, but to defend the very idea of freedom for the world. The drums of war thundered again, louder and deadlier than ever before. In 1939, as Europe burned under the weight of tyranny, America tried to stay distant. But evil has a way of crossing oceans. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor in 1941, everything changed. The sleeping giant awoke, not with vengeance, but with resolve. This time, the fight for freedom would reach every corner of the earth. Men and women from every walk of life answered the call. Farmers became soldiers. Teachers became nurses. Young boys who had never left their hometowns crossed oceans to defend ideals they barely understood but deeply believed in. And behind the front lines, factories roared with life. Women filled the workforce, wielding hammers and rivets, keeping the heartbeat of the war machine alive. They were known as Rosie the Riveter. But Rosie was more than a symbol. She was millions of women, proving that strength had no gender. Far from the spotlight, another group made history in silence. The Navajo Code Talkers, Native American Marines who used their language to create an unbreakable code, turned the tide in the Pacific. Their words, once forbidden in schools, became the weapon that helped win the war. In Europe, the Tuskegee Airmen soared through the skies, their red-tailed planes escorting bombers with unmatched precision. They fought two battles, one against fascism abroad and another against racism at home. Their courage painted the skies with honor and redefined what it meant to be an American hero. World War Roman II demanded everything America had to give, and the nation gave it. The war ended not with triumphal arrogance, but with solemn victory. When peace finally returned, the United States stood changed forever. It had become the defender of democracy, the hope of the free world, and the architect of a new global order. But power came with responsibility and temptation. The post-war years brought prosperity, but also fear. The Cold War began an invisible struggle between freedom and oppression, democracy and dictatorship. In the shadows of nuclear tension, America faced its own internal contradictions once again. The nation that had defeated fascism still denied equality to many of its own citizens. But as always, voices rose from the margins to demand justice. The civil rights movement was born not in palaces or parliaments, but in buses, schools, and churches. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat and sparked a revolution of dignity. Martin Luther King Jr. marched with words sharper than any blade, preaching that love could conquer hate. His dream was not naive, it was necessary. Behind him were thousands of unsung heroes, students, mothers, preachers, janitors who faced beatings, jails, and bombs to keep the promise of America alive. Freedom riders braved fire and fists to desegregate buses. Little girls in Birmingham faced jeers just to go to school. Medgar Evers gave his life so others could vote. Each act of courage added another brick to the road toward equality. The civil rights movement didn't just change laws, it changed hearts. And once again, the world was watching. America was proving that greatness was not in perfection, but in progress. Meanwhile, innovation surged again. The same country that once fought to light a single bulb now raced to reach the stars. Scientists, dreamers, and engineers launched rockets that pierced the heavens. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon in 1969, he spoke for all humanity, but the hands that built that moment belonged to thousands of unnamed engineers, mathematicians, and workers. Among them was Katherine Johnson, a black mathematician whose calculations guided astronauts safely home. Her story, like so many others, had waited decades to be told. By the end of the 20th century, the United States had faced war, division, and doubt, yet it stood stronger, not because it was flawless, but because it kept rebuilding itself. Every generation had produced new heroes, known and unknown, who carried the torch of liberty a little farther forward. And the story was far from over. The 1970s arrived with the hum of uncertainty. The war in Vietnam had divided the nation. The protests on college campuses echoed a single question: what had America become? Yet even in division, there was reflection. The dream was not broken, it was being redefined. Every movement, every challenge forced the nation to confront its conscience and grow stronger from its wounds. Out of turmoil came transformation. The women's movement gained force, demanding equality not just in law but in life. Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, and millions of others raised their voices, but it wasn't only leaders who shaped this revolution. It was mothers, daughters, and workers across America who refused to accept less than equal respect. The dream of liberty was expanding again, no longer limited by gender, race, or background. Technology began to reshape every corner of society. Silicon Valley was still just a cluster of garages and wild ideas, yet within those spaces, the future was taking form. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak built the first personal computers with almost nothing but imagination. Bill Gates dreamed of putting a computer in every home. And behind them, countless unknown engineers and designers worked sleepless nights, crafting the foundation of a digital world that would soon connect billions. America was entering a new kind of revolution, not of armies or ideologies, but of innovation. The same spirit that once built railroads and rockets now built microchips and networks. The internet, once a military experiment, became a bridge between people and ideas across the globe. America's greatest export was no longer just products, it was possibility. But progress always comes with a price. As technology advanced, inequality and tension persisted. The fight for civil rights evolved into new battles for LGBTQ+ equality, for environmental justice, for the right to live free from fear and discrimination. In every decade, new voices rose to continue the legacy of courage. Harvey Milk, the first openly gay elected official in California, spoke of hope when the world offered hate. His words ignited a movement that still burns bright today. While the Cold War came to an end, another chapter began. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than a victory over communism, it was a triumph of belief. America had helped prove that ideas are stronger than empires. Yet, as the 21st century dawned, the world entered a new era of uncertainty. On a clear September morning in 2001, tragedy struck. The attacks on September 11th shook the very heart of the nation. But out of the smoke and rubble, the true spirit of America revealed itself once more. Firefighters running toward danger, strangers helping strangers, ordinary citizens becoming extraordinary heroes. They reminded the world that courage is not born from power, it is born from love, from duty, from the refusal to give in to fear. In the years that followed, America changed again. Wars were fought, politics grew divided, but amid the noise, the same heartbeat continued: the pursuit of freedom, the belief in progress, and the resilience to rebuild. The 2008 election of Barack Obama marked another turning point, the first African-American president, a symbol of how far the nation had come and how far it could still go. His message of hope and unity reignited a timeless truth, that America's strength lies not in uniformity, but in its diversity. In recent years, new generations have taken up the mantle, young voices demanding climate action, equality, and justice. Innovators like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have looked once again toward the stars, continuing the legacy of exploration that began decades ago. Scientists, doctors, and teachers, especially during the global pandemic, became heroes not with medals or fame, but with quiet service and sacrifice. Through every challenge, wars, depressions, divisions, and doubts, the United States has remained a nation in constant motion, driven by one enduring idea, that tomorrow can always be better. It is a country built not by perfect people, but by persistent ones, by dreamers, doers, and believers who turn hope into history. And as the story of America continues, its greatest chapters may still be unwritten, waiting for new heroes to rise, new ideas to be born, and new generations to carry the promise of freedom forward. Every great story has no true ending, only new beginnings. The story of the United States is no exception. It began with rebellion, grew through struggle, and endures through renewal. From the ink-stained desks of the Founding Fathers to the digital glow of modern screens, one thread connects them all: the belief that freedom is not a gift handed down, but a torch passed forward. America's history is a mosaic of millions of lives, some remembered, many forgotten. Farmers who plowed the soil so others could eat. Teachers who lit minds with curiosity. Nurses who stood between life and death without seeking recognition. Artists, scientists, immigrants, soldiers, and dreamers, each one built a piece of the nation's character. They may not appear in textbooks, but their fingerprints are on everything. When you walk through the streets of New York, the echoes of immigrants whisper from the bricks. In the fields of Georgia and the factories of Detroit, generations of workers built prosperity with bare hands. In Silicon Valley, visionaries reimagined what was possible. And in small towns across America, people still rise each morning believing they can make tomorrow brighter than today. This, more than power or wealth, is what has made America great: its endless capacity to reinvent itself. A nation born from revolution learned to heal its own divisions. A people who once denied freedom to many learned to expand it to all. Each era, each movement has stretched the meaning of the American promise a little wider. Freedom in America was never static. It grew through argument, through protest, through courage. It was defended on battlefields and debated in courts. It was written in speeches and carved into hearts. The founders dreamed of liberty. The unsung heroes made it real. Every generation has carried that dream, adding their own verse to a song still being written. When we look at America's past, we see not perfection, but persistence. A nation that fell, rose, and rebuilt itself countless times. Its greatness has never been about being flawless. It has always been about striving. The willingness to look at its own reflection, to question, to change, to improve. That is the courage that keeps the American experiment alive. In every century, there have been those who stood in the shadows, holding the fabric of the nation together. The medics on foreign soil who saved lives they'd never know. The civil rights volunteers who marched into hatred, armed only with faith. The scientists who stayed unseen behind discoveries that changed the world. The firefighters, teachers, nurses, and parents who shaped the nation quietly, one act of love at a time. They are the invisible pillars of greatness. And still, the story continues. New challenges rise: climate change, inequality, global uncertainty. But if history has taught us anything, it is that America's strength lies in its ability to adapt, to listen, to evolve, to lead not just with might, but with example. Every struggle births new leaders, and every crisis reveals hidden heroes. So, what truly makes the United States one of the greatest nations in the world? It is not its armies or its wealth. It is the unbreakable belief that no dream is too big, no person too small, no future too far. It is the constant tension between what is and what could be a restless spirit that refuses to settle for less than progress. The story of America is not a finished book. It is a living idea written every day by those who dare to believe in something better. From the fields of 1776 to the stars above Mars, from the voices that shouted for freedom to the hands that quietly built it, the same promise endures, that liberty, justice, and opportunity belong to all who reach for them. As long as that dream survives, so will the nation that was built upon it. For America's greatest power has never been its flag or its borders, it has always been its people, the famous and the forgotten, the rebels and the reformers, the founders and the unsung heroes. Together, they made a nation that changed the world, and their story, the story of the United States, is still being written.